Welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Mikkel Thorpe, and this is the Expat Money Show. Today's guest is an American writer, publisher, and filmmaker. He currently hosts the Wiggin Sessions, a YouTube show covering the financial markets, the economy, and politics. He writes the Financial Daily, the Daily Missive, and host and editor of The Essential Investor, a fundamental resource for individuals managing their money. Please welcome to the show, Addison Wiggin. Addison, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Mikkel. Thanks for having me on.
Pleasure is all mine. Why don't we take a minute and kind of go through your backstory? We were chit-chatting about your books and your work. How did you decide that this is what you wanted to do with your career?
Yeah, interestingly enough, I have my education was in philosophy. I actually in English literature. I have an undergraduate degree in American short fiction, and then a philosophy master's from St. John's College in Annapolis and in Santa Fe. In my early days, when I was trying to figure out what to do, I had the quintessential quarters in the couch moment. I didn't have any money. I was in graduate school. I was planning to get married to my wife, who is currently my wife now. We have 3 kids together now. But at the time, I was trying to get on a bus to go to a job interview, and I didn't have enough money to get on the bus. So we literally looked through the couch to find quarters, and I got just enough money to get on the bus. So I was dead broke, but I knew I was interested in publishing for sure. With that background, I was interested in writing, and I like history, and I like economics and the way markets work. That's just what I gravitated towards. And I found, I was in Annapolis at the time, and I found on the bulletin board at St. John's College a long time ago, a 3x5 card looking for writers. And it was a publishing company based in Baltimore. I applied and eventually got accepted to work there. Little did I know that the writing they wanted me to do was sales copy, and I didn't even know what that was at the time. And the company was a new company in the marketplace called Agora Publishing. And I ended up working directly with the founder, Bill Bonner, for many years, over 15 years. Came to be really good friends with him. He's probably a well-known character to your audience. I studied directly with him. He moved his family to Paris first, but I soon followed after, and we lived in Paris for 5 years and founded what we thought was the first email financial newsletter in the industry, which was called the Financial Daily Reckoning, which we publish to this day. So I cut my teeth writing about libertarian economics and history and booms and busts, and how all of those kind of big picture ideas get played out in the market every day. So it's kind of a broad look at history and where we are in it, and what that means for people trying to manage their own money in the markets. So that I actually say all the time, I couldn't do the work that I do without having an English degree, because it's primarily writing, and I'm interested in writing. I'm interested in the craft of it, and without studying philosophy, religion, economics, that kind of stuff, because all of those things come to play in this thing we know as the marketplace. And Agora actually means marketplace in Greek, so it was a good fit for me. But then now, actually, my 30th anniversary just passed. It's the only actual job other than bartending and that kind of stuff, that I've ever had. So it's been a long ride, and Bill and I wrote a couple books together. And as we were talking before getting on the show here, this year I have a series of 3rd editions coming out of, actually have 2 of them right here. 3rd edition of Demise of the Dollar, which is a look at the U.S. attempt to manage a fiat currency since the Bretton Woods exchange rate system was taken down in 1971, and a lot of history that goes into that brings us to the great inflation of 2023, and then Financial Reckoning Day, which Bill and I co-wrote in 2000. We started in 2001 as we were covering the dot-com bubble and bust, and it was the foundational principles for the Daily Reckoning. These two books are coming out actually, they're both out. This one just came out yesterday in its third edition. And then a third book that Bill and I wrote together was called The Empire of Debt. And it's really look at the history of the politics that led the United States to become the most influential political force, cultural force, economic force in the world. And we rose to the level of empire, like greater than any empire that's roamed the earth before. But we've done it all on extending debt. We have this phrase that we use all the time. We came, the Romans would say, we came, we saw, we conquered. And the American version of that is, we came, we saw, we borrowed. And that can't be any more of a threat to people's financial situation than it is today, especially since the summer of 2020. The bond market's all messed up because the amount of deficit spending that's been going on to combat a self-inflicted wound of the pandemic and the lockdowns. And just this year alone, we had a deficit of $2 trillion for the fiscal year that ended September 29th. And it's a relatively peaceful economy. We're fighting two proxy wars at the moment. But this is a peacetime economy that can't sustain itself. It has to borrow $2 trillion a year just to keep going. It's a mess, and that's been my work for 30 years, is trying to put the pieces together to help it be understandable to a wider audience. But also, what do you do about it? How do you live in this world? I know your show is mostly listened to by expats. That's definitely one of the avenues that we've explored over the years. Bill is good friends with Doug Casey, who I've got to know over the years. And I'm just intrigued and interested in the themes that he continually finds. and his franchise, it's more than just a book, but International Man has taken on a strong meaning for your audience, I'm sure, and many of the people that you talk to.
Yep, I'm a very good friend of, well, Doug's a very good friend of mine, and a man that I respect very much. And all the team over at International Man, Nick and Mona and everybody are just such fantastic people, really good, honest, ethical people, and putting out fantastic work. And, Doug's he's a legend. I mean, there's no question about that at all. Now, I have a question. I guess it's kind of interesting, the timings of the third edition for your books, because I think that most people, certainly on this program, will understand that, we believe that there is a massive reckoning coming. I mean, there's a massive crash coming, but things that I would have thought would have happened 6 months ago, a year ago, 2 years ago, it's still been just pushed out a little bit later. And I just expect to wake up tomorrow and the whole world just melting down. Now, we've had tons of problems with COVIDs, and not really with COVID, but with government's response to COVID. And now the wars are center stage and the money printing is just out of control. But how is it that the market is still kind of afloat right now?
Well, that is a really good question. And in the process of updating the books, it was almost a project of changing tenses. Like, we expected there to be an onslaught of heavy or rapidly rising inflation, but it happened about a decade after we initially forecast it. We didn't account for, in the early editions of the books, we didn't account for ZIRP, zero interest rate policy, for almost a decade. And we didn't account for what has become quantitative easing, QE1, 2, 3. Those are all programs put on by the Fed that kick the can down the road continually. And there's a whole period of time in between like 2011 and 2021 where corporate America, the banking industry worldwide, Congress itself, everybody got used to the low interest rates. and started planning budgets accordingly, including the financing of the national debt. And we were burning the candle at both ends for that entire time, but it seemed okay because interest rates were so low, and there was a ton of money being pumped into the stock market. The Wall Street banks were in cahoots essentially with the Federal Reserve. Money was flowing in there, and then they were chasing yields all over the place. So we saw bubbles in things like cryptocurrency, and we saw bubbles in pot stocks for a while. The most recent one we've seen was in AI-related stocks, NVIDIA becoming $1 trillion company. That money has to go somewhere, and it's only after the lockdowns and American consumers started spending away the savings that they had in 2020 and 2021 that we saw the inflation just take off in the economy globally that we had forecast leading up. But we thought it was going to happen in 2011, 2012. But it got kicked down the road for another 10 years after that. So in editing the books, I'm like, we said this will happen, and I'm changing it to, and this happened. It's like changing tense to will to has happened.
So you might have been early, but you weren't wrong.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's the challenge of forecasting anyway, is we could be right for 10 years and it doesn't come to fruition. Timing still matters. And that's part of my work too, is we publish newsletters, and we have analysts who are looking at, on a more micro level, financial advice based on different investing strategies and or looking at different sectors. And that's where the rubber meets the road. And most of them are pretty conscious of reading the market as it is, even if they agree with the thesis that on a macro level, things are falling apart. You still have to figure out how to manage your money in the meantime. And the newsletters that we publish are targeted towards specific areas that people are interested in, like energy and precious metals. And well, we were big on treasuries for a bit until we've just gone through the largest sell-off, or the most aggressive sell-off in U.S. Treasury since the Treasury was founded. The actual T-notes were founded in 1787. So we're in uncharted territory, but you still have to read the market and figure out what you're going to do with your money.
Mm-hmm. Well, so to go back to the original question, you've laid out the problems, and I agree with them, and I see them, and I think a lot of people are on the same page with us. But how is it that things have not, how we haven't had meltdown yet? Like, why did it not happen last Tuesday or something like that? Like, what is holding on? Because it just seems like by the skin of their teeth, they are just holding on.
Yeah, I would just say that bad policies lead to more bad policies. And we've seen, in one of the, it's actually in a special report I wrote that's in addition to these books, was just looking at Fed policy starting in 1987. The era in the 70s and the early 80s when we had rapid inflation, and then the Volcker era is pretty well documented. I wasn't looking at that period. I was looking at the Greenspan era, and then what happened subsequent to that. Starts in 1987 when we had the flash crash. The Dow lost like 507 points in one trading day, which was enormous at that time. And the Fed met that challenge by lowering interest rates and pumping money into the market. And that worked for a time. And then we had the Mexican crisis in 92, and then LTCM in 98, and then the dot-com busts. And in each case, they used the same grab bag of tools. They met a crisis with more money, and they're continually doing that. 2008, just printing money wasn't enough, so they had to drastically lower interest rates. And then they had to start buying assets in the market to support Wall Street, basically. And each time the crisis rears its head, they come up with more inventive ways to kick the can down the road. But they never do address the problem that you and I are aware of, which is they're just spending too much money and they can't get their books together in Washington. And that's a hallmark of fiat currency management throughout history. And in time, they all fail. All fiat regimes fail. We're just in the throes of one that happens to be a global phenomenon. It's the first time that we've had a central bank of the Fed stature that effectively is the world's central bank. Even though there's challenges from Russia and the BRICS nations, they're trying to put together a currency that where they wouldn't have to use the dollar as the reserve currency of the world. But I think that's a far way off still. And we benefit greatly from that reserve currency status in the world. I say we Americans who are not expats generally. Your audience is probably much more educated on how to get out of the dollar and move their money around in precious metals and even cryptocurrencies as a way of not being subject to the policies that they come up with each time there is a crisis. I was just this morning, I was going through the bond sell-off, and they came up with, we had the banking crisis. It looked like it was going to be a full-blown banking crisis in March of 2023. It started in the crypto sector with the collapse of FTX, and the people who had dumped so much money into currencies, especially tech entrepreneurs and those kinds of people. When FTX collapsed, and we're now starting to peel back the layers and see what fraud went on there. That led a lot of people to want to take their money out of Silicon Valley Bank. Was the first headline bank to go under. They had put a ton of money in treasuries, and as interest rates went up, the cost of or the value of the treasuries that they owned were worth less than what they bought them, because as yields go up, price goes down. And as tech entrepreneurs, startups got worried about their money, that was the bulk of the money that was sitting in Silicon Valley Bank. They started taking their money out to cover crypto losses and or just to ensure payrolls for their startups. And in order to cover the withdrawals, Silicon Valley Bank had to sell treasuries. So the whole thing is wrapped up in a speculative boom and bust, and it caught Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, and then a couple of weeks later, First Republic, all got caught in that cycle. And what the Fed did to avert that crisis, it only lasted in the headlines from March until May. Mm-hmm. And then it moved on like, oh, that crisis is over. We've got a debt ceiling debate that has the potential of getting the Treasury downgraded, which would make everything worse. So that took over the headlines, but the banking crisis never went away. What the Fed did is they stepped in and they said they'd buy all of those assets that Silicon Valley Bank, for example, had to sell at a loss. They were going to buy them, and they have been buying them at lower than, at face value. The bonds, both government bonds and corporate bonds, are trading at lower than their face value in the market, but the Fed has stepped in and has been buying them when necessary at face value to avert other banks going under and getting people worried about their own money in the bank. And the subsequent result of that is the Fed in the fiscal year of 2023 is losing money. The Federal Reserve itself has lost over, I think it's $111 billion in the last 13 months. So they come up with different programs and they give them funny titles like BFTC or whatever. But that's why the crisis continues to grow, is they're throwing bad policies after bad policies. And each one is designed to sort of avert the crisis that is dominating the headline news. And it's actually entertaining as a writer to watch, because you're like, oh, that's going to work well. I have this phrase that I say in my head when I look at government solutions and stuff, and I think, oh, what could go wrong with that? And I start with what could go wrong, and I just start digging in, and you can usually find some bureaucrat in Washington who's a genius behind some new policy that really is meant to save their jobs and keep the system afloat. It's kind of a cynical way of looking at things, but it helps answer a lot of questions.
No, it makes a lot of sense. So really what I hear you saying, and to use your own analogy of the grab bag, I mean, you're reaching out, or they're reaching in, pulling out toys, pulling out all these things. But at some point they're going to reach in and there's going to be nothing left in the bag. I mean, they can only keep doing these types of things so many times, right? It can't go on forever, can it?
Well, I don't think it can go on forever, but that is a big part of trying to understand history and what goes on. In Financial Reckoning Day, we go all the way back to the Mississippi scheme in France, and we look at that was a experiment with fiat currency. John Law, who was a goldsmith's son, invented paper notes for the Bank of France in order to fund the various wars that Louis XIV had been in. Louis XIV. Louis XV was actually was the king at the time, but he worked with the Duc d'Orléans, who was running the nation's finances. There was a scheme where they printed banknotes for the Bank of France, and then they used treasury notes from the French treasury to buy those banknotes and give them value. But it was a way of creating government decree for a paper currency. And there was a huge a huge amount of capital that went in buying these notes as it went up, and it created a bubble like we've seen numerous times since then. And they themselves tried different things. At one point, this is funny because it's in history and it seems quaint, but at one point the jig was up and the general public was becoming aware that there was no value behind this paper that they were told had value. And it was starting to cause inflation, and just general goods and everything were getting more expensive. So John Law and the Duc d'Orléans came up with this idea. They rounded up all these beggars on the streets of Paris, and they gave them mining helmets, shovels, picks, and those things. And they paraded them through Paris and on the streets all the way to Nantes, which at the time, traveling that far would have taken 3 or 4 days. And so they went through the countryside marching, and they were going to get on ships and go to the New World, to this island called Mississippi. And they were going to dig for gold because there were gold reserves on this island that they were going to bring back. And that would be what funded the paper. It all kind of fell apart when those same beggars, once they got to Nantes, they left and they went back to their old hunting grounds in Paris. And the shopkeepers and stuff were like, didn't you bring back any gold? And it became obvious that the whole thing was a fraud. So it's interesting to look back in history what governments have done historically. Generally, like we had a gold standard under the Victorian pound for 70 years, and global trade flourished and all that kind of stuff. But 13 countries in Europe disassembled their own gold, their own connection to the British pound in 1913, because you can't fight wars on a gold standard. You need fiat currency. You don't know how much stuff you're going to build and blow up. You don't know how much it's going to cost. You don't know how long the war is going to last. So you have to put the printing press in action in order to build armaments and actually fight the wars. That was a big lesson of First World War. And we just see that over and over again, where if the powers that be, people that are making policy, if they just kick the can down the road over and over again and come up with justifications for fighting wars and sort of justifying the enormity of the state, it always ends badly. And I know that we're all asking the question, well, how is this one going to end badly, and when? It'd be great to know when. But we're all kind of in the same boat, where everyone is doing what they can to manage the system. We take cues from the stock market. A lot of people that we write to are trying to take what capital they have and make more through trading options and investing in tech companies that have good headlines pushing the stock up. that's one way of managing your money. And that's all you can really do in a system that is, every time there's a crisis, there's some new program put in place that's supposed to avert the crisis. But there's no real addressing of the main problem, which is they spend more than they take in receipts. The government does. And they make up for it by printing more money and distributing that through the financial system. So there's a symbiosis between government and the way the financial structure works right now. And historically, it ends badly for everyone. So the best thing that you can do as an investor is recognize that and plan accordingly.
Well, on the note of war, I mean, I really have no idea what the US is thinking. Okay, it was one thing they were at war with Iraq and Afghanistan, and then they left, and we thought maybe things would go a little bit better, and maybe we'd be not so aggressive. Once again, I say we as well as the collective West, and then as a proxy war in Russia, and now potentially going to war with China, and then more aggressive with North Korea, and now in the Middle East, and then Iran. And now what's going to happen with Turkey? It's just like piling on and on and on. And I mean, these are other nuclear powered country or nuclear armament countries. It just seems pure insanity to me.
Yeah, if you look at what happened in the 30s, the last time we entered into a true, historically, we call it a global war that never really ended. But World War II was an effort to defeat totalitarianism, right? Like America got on board and sent our boys overseas, and we fought that war for patriotic reasons. But what really precipitated that whole thing was in the 30s, starting when the stock market crashed in 1929. We had a debt crisis then, and we also had a bank failure. I wrote a report to go along with our bank analysis in March called Anatomy of a Bust, The Banks Go First, because I was reading Anatomy of a Bubble by Garrett, who was a financial journalist in the early 30s and continued on after that. But he was really focused on what had gone wrong with the stock market and then how it was working its way through the economy in the 30s. And he outlines how debt built up and then was filtered through the financial system through banks, and there were no stopgap measures in place to avert bank runs. And then it just kind of made it into the popular culture that the economy was doing bad and that we needed the government to come in and save the day. FDR took the bull by the horns there, and that's where we get a lot of the centralization of the government that we now have. We got it in the 30s in the wake of a credit bust and banking crisis. And then because at the time, the U.S. Was the world's manufacturer as well as a great exporter of grains and things that the world needed, or needs. And we, just on the manufacturing front, we produce 30% of the world's goods and we ship them overseas. So when our economy got into trouble, everybody who was a net creditor to us got in trouble too, because the system kind of broke down. And we had trade wars because people were trying to keep prices higher. And that system of global trade fell apart and led to, because people get anxious and start doing stupid things when the economy is not functioning, it led to the rise of the Nazis in Germany and Mussolini and the Japanese movement in the South Pacific. So that's what happens when things start falling apart, is the people who want centralized control coalesce that they make promises to address people's economic anxiety, and that gives them the power to then pass the policies that they expect everyone to follow. And you can see encroaching violence in civil society. Civil society itself is falling apart. There was just another mass shooting yesterday in Lewiston, Maine, which is like as rural as any small town gets. And something like 22 people were killed at a bowling alley. But we're seeing a lot more of that kind of activity as civil society reacts to an economy that's not producing the goods, and we see all kinds of protests about Black Lives Matter and things like that, where if people were gainfully employed and the economy was growing and satisfying the needs of the people who depend on it, they wouldn't be out in the streets protesting anything. So we're seeing that decay on a societal level, but the world order that was built around the U.S. winning the Cold War and the dynamism of the tech industry kind of selling phones all over the world, that was supposed to be the end of history. If you remember, Francis Fukuyama wrote a piece at the end of at the break after the wall came down in Berlin. This is the end of history because American free market capitalism is going to take over and everybody's going to embrace democracy. I mean, the history since then shows that that's, if anything, that's the opposite of
what's happening, especially in the last 3 years. My goodness.
Yeah, and since the pandemic, I mean, that was the first time the government quarantined the healthy, and we did it globally. What did they think was going to happen?
No, it's
we
absolutely
shut down the global economy, and now we have to rebuild it with massive amounts of debt. Every central bank is just yesterday, the Swiss central bank, which is the oldest central bank in the world, sent a letter to Parliament in Sweden saying we need the equivalent of $7 billion or the bank is insolvent. But they were doing the same thing. They were running QE programs and a ZERP they started negative interest rates before the Federal Reserve even did. So it's a systemic problem that is global, and you're starting to see, you mentioned all of the different political challenges the U.S. has, not just the U.S., but the consortium that sits behind NATO. All the Western countries that are running their country on fiat currencies are now challenged by just a new wave of nationalism in many different areas. The thing that's going on in Israel right now, I'm afraid that that's going to spread to direct conflict,
contagion for sure.
Yeah.
So, with your study of history and your study of World War I and World War II, do you see parallels or similarities that are leading us into World War III? Or would you even argue that we are in World War III right now, but it's just not been announced?
I wouldn't call it World War III yet, but it definitely has all the hallmarks of getting there. And one of the things that I have also noticed, and it's sort of like just a guide to follow, is that the British pound was the reserve currency of the world during the entire Victorian era leading up to World War I. And it really took 2 world wars and a Great Depression for the US dollar to become the reserve currency of the world. And that was really done by decree at the Bretton Woods conference that they put together at the end of World War II to reimagine the global monetary system, knowing that all of the economies of Europe had been destroyed in the war. And the US dollar became the reserve currency of the world simply because at the time, the U.S. economy was the most robust, even though it had turned into a wartime economy intended to produce munitions that then got destroyed. It was the only one that didn't have, we didn't have pitched battles on the North American continent. So we were left standing, and during the war, we accumulated 73% of the world's gold reserves. So it made sense at the time to make the dollar the reserve currency of the world, and then back it by gold. And then the exchange rate system stipulated that if anybody else, France or Brazil or anybody, wanted to trade their currency in for dollars, they would have to do it for dollars, not for gold directly, but for US dollars. And then the dollar itself was backed by gold, or redeemable for gold. That whole system fell apart in 1971, and most of the economic dislocations we've seen since then are because the U.S. dollar is the reserve currency of the world, and we didn't want to give our gold away, so we shut the gold window, and then we just.
Do you think they still have the gold?
I don't know.
When's the last time Fort Knox was audited?
Yeah,
50 years ago, something like that. 60 years ago.
I don't know. And people trade gold all the time, so there's been a concerted effort to consider gold not money, just as a commodity, and the U.S. has definitely been in that camp forever, just saying the Federal Reserve doesn't consider gold as money.
Yeah, and, well, even the IRS considers it a collectible.
Yeah, and like most of the Western central banks have the same view. Bank of England has sold off most of their gold reserves. Japan has sold off theirs. And the U.S. hasn't reported how much they actually have, but they don't consider it an important thing to publish. Kind of like when they took down M3, the broadest measure of how much money is in the 100%. System. They stopped reporting it because they didn't want people to know. So anyway, I think the broader point is that studying even just the 20th century, it took 2 world wars for a new global currency to emerge after the Victorian era global trade system was destroyed. It still took a number of years to find an alternative that worked decently until 1971. And then everything that has happened since then just proves that we're not immune to the same forces of economic history as any other country. So where does it go from here? That's really the question: is what is going to replace the U.S. dollar? And generally, when looking forward, it's hard to pinpoint what events are going to precipitate any other crisis or anything. Like a couple of weeks ago, we wouldn't have been talking about Israel and Hamas at all. That kind of came out of the blue, but it comes on top of the debate about trying to finance Ukraine's defense against Russia and the long trade war that we've been having with China and the tension over Taiwan. Like all those things exist, but it could be that Hamas decision to attack Israel is like our Sarajevo moment, the moment when Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, that kicked off the
World War One.
I mean, the way I can see that playing out is that the U.S. has already sent 2 carrier groups to the Western Mediterranean, and they've been just sending warnings to Iran not to support Hezbollah or whatever, not to broaden the war that Israel is undertaking against Hamas. It's not going to take much to kick that over into a broader war. And the U.S. has already been all over, as you have pointed out, Iraq and Afghanistan. We've been on either side of Iran for 30 years, or like physically on their borders. So,
on the same scope as I was saying before, might be right, but might be early, but not wrong. When I was living in the Middle East, I was there for nearly a decade, and I was taking a look around and went, I think war with Iran is coming. And I picked up my family and I moved them across the world, and I moved them to Latin America because I could see what was happening. Okay, I was 4 years too early, but I'd rather be 4 years too early than 5 minutes too late. Right. And I clearly can see the writing on the wall, and I can see the sentiments changing, and it's just getting worse and worse and worse. I want to be physically located well away from that. And I think that things will be very different in the United States this time around. I think that they have Hezbollah and Hamas like all through the US. I mean, the immigration process in the United States is just crazy. There's no idea who is in that country right now. And I think that when we enter into another World War III, and I believe we will, it's going to be a lot closer to home this time than World War I and World War II was.
Yeah, and I think too, if you look back in history, like World War One, the roots of World War I were in 1870, the war between the Franco-Prussian War, the war between France and what would become Germany because of that war. They weren't even a country or a nation before that, the Franco-Prussian War. Like if you read what people are writing in the turn of the century, and then there was a financial panic in 1907, or if you read what was going on with the rise of fascism in Europe, in the US, we were aware of those things. So there's always the trends in place that people are aware of that lead to wars of magnitude. But what we remember when we look back is not what people were afraid of coming down the road. What we remember are the flashpoints or the catalysts that kick things off. So the biggest one, the most notorious one, I guess, is the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. That's what we know about.
Surprise with quotation marks, but yes.
Yeah. That's what we know, like historically, for most people that don't pay attention to the trends or even aren't interested in financial markets or anything. That's what we know about World War II, that Japan attacked us without warning, and that justified going to war with them. And since they were already allied with Germany, then we ended up going to war with them too. But all of those trends historically were in place and people were well aware of them. So just as you're talking about moving away from the Middle East, this conflict with Iran has been coming since the late 60s, really.
Yeah.
Whenever we had the Shah in place and we're trying to control the oil flow out of that country.
Mm-hmm. It's scary times. I mean, legitimate. I mean, I'm still a young guy. I'm 40 years old. But I've asked people I've asked Doug and other guys that I talked to who are in their 70s and 80s, and in their lifetime, have they ever seen anything like this? And the answer is no. Like, I mean, it's just, this is all uncharted waters in front of us.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that class of libertarian writers, Doug and Bill Bonner is another one. And that's who I have been working with. They were well aware of the trends that were in place in the 80s and 90s. Bill actually got involved early in his own career in the National Taxpayers Union because he was aware that the government was overspending even in the 70s and 80s, and everyone was afraid of inflation at that time. And he started a nonprofit called the National Taxpayers Union. And ultimately, that group is the one that got the Taxpayers Bill of Rights passed. It was him and Jim Davidson. They grew up together in Maryland, and they founded National Taxpayers Union together. And that nonprofit spun off a for-profit company that became Agora Publishing. And so they've been looking at this crisis from the same point of view since the late 70s. And the first publication that Bill put out, we still call it the landmark publication of Agora, is International Living. And it's all about helping people take what money they have, expatriate, and living off of a smaller amount of capital in better jurisdictions for your money and for your taxes. So that is the very core of the business that I've been working with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but maybe I should clarify a little bit. They've been very right about predicting a lot of the economic things. But if we talk to, a lot of the gentlemen that I work with, they've never seen anything like the government's response to COVID. They've never seen shutting down entire economies. They've never seen this type of totalitarianism in the Western society. Like, it's just not existed. Like, this is really new things. And it's one after another after another. The last 3 years has been absolutely crazy. It's
and that's kind of where I was getting, is that those trends were all in place, but they seemed reasonable and relatively civilized if we look back 30 years. But but the things that the government finds itself self-empowered to do, I mean, they're trampling all over civil rights, for example, just because they are aware of the crisis, and they grab hold of the authority to do something about it. The whole thing with the pandemic lockdowns was just a charade from day one. I remember the day that Maryland shut down its restaurants and bars, because Chicago had done it like a week before that, and I was like, "There's no way that's going to happen." I still didn't believe it at that time. I don't know what world I was living in, but I guess we're all just shocked that they would take it to that level, and then it would go global at the same time. So yeah, I guess I'm agreeing with you that all of these trends have been in place, and we've been cataloging them and trying to understand them, and also try to forecast what we think is going to come next for many years. But the magnitude of the crisis keeps growing, and the magnitude of the response grows with it. So we keep getting a more centralized and authoritarian government, which is, it's anathema to the idea of the Constitution in the first place. So, yeah, I don't know where this goes, but it doesn't end well.
Well, I agree with that sentiment. Absolutely. Now, to circle back on reserve currencies, what's your opinion on CBDCs? Besides, obviously, they're terrible, but do you think that they're going to succeed with these? Do you think that will be the new reserve currencies? Do you see any hope coming down the line with a gold-backed currency or something a little bit more fiscally responsible? What's your opinion?
Well, I think that the operative word there or phrase would be fiscally responsible. I don't think they're really interested in fiscally responsible. They're more interested in control of the currency itself. I will say with central bank digital currencies, I think there is a benefit to it. And this sometimes gets overlooked because of the privacy concerns, and also just the idea that it would be easier for the government to track your spending and exert authoritarian measures on your private life, your private finances, in a way that we've never seen before. It gives them the capacity to do that. But since even before CBDCs were a regular topic for people to discuss, I was looking at cryptocurrencies. We've been covering Bitcoin for as long as anyone. We started covering in 2009 when Bitcoin was under $1. And the whole time I've been thinking that the innovation behind it, blockchain and the ability to encrypt and make transactions private, is the one benefit that crypto brings to the table. And the analogy I use is when the dot-com bubble was rising, there was all these companies that were fraudulently claiming that they were tech companies and just taking money out of the stock market, and that whole thing collapsed. But at the end, we were left with email and websites and an internet that most people could use. And as time has gone by, it replaced it became the architecture of the economy that we all make our livings on. I think the same thing is true of blockchain. It makes banking more efficient, which can cut out middlemen and drop fees. There are a lot of good things that could come from it. The danger is when it gets put into the hands of people who aren't really interested. They're interested in the efficiency, but using it for nefarious means, what we would consider nefarious means. And then they cloak it in terminology that makes it sound like they're doing everyone a favor by making it more efficient or whatever. But what they're really interested in is controlling the banking system. I actually just wrote about that in a special report that I have out on the internet right now called The Great American Shell Game. They're telling you on one hand that this is all good. They're going to avert the crisis. The banking system is going to be more efficient, and we're going to be able to control the economy more efficiently. On the other hand, they are controlling the economy more efficiently, and it gives them another tool to centralize power in the Federal Reserve in the banking system and ultimately in the government, regardless of who's in Congress or in the White House. So that's the scary part, is that it's the CBDCs are in the wrong hands. I think the efficiency that it brings to the banking system is a good thing, should bring costs down over time. But in the wrong hands, it's frightening, because they can lock you out of your own accounts if they want to.
And do you think that they're going to succeed with rolling out these CBDCs, not just in the United States, but in other countries? Do you think that, we might get a CBDC as a reserve currency? Well, it won't be the US dollar anymore?
Yeah, there are a couple test cases that are operating right now. Off the top of my head, I can't recount them because I haven't been covering it for a bit.
There's Nigeria, and they failed miserably. It was like a 99%.
Yeah, El Salvador is another one.
There's a bunch of different countries. I mean, I've sat in on meetings with central bankers. I was just in Georgia last month, and we had a central banker, the head of the Central Bank of Georgia, at a conference that I was speaking at, and asked all his questions. And he was so happy about the whole thing. He was so bullish on it. He had no idea who he was talking to. It was a giant group of 100 libertarians, and was just like, this is the greatest thing ever. And people were like, they were livid. They were like foaming at the mouth. They were, it was very bizarre situation to watch.
Yeah, and El Salvador did an experiment too that backfired on them, because they had converted a bunch of money into Bitcoin itself, and then Bitcoin fell apart, and it had the exact opposite impact on the economy that they were expecting. But to me, that's a hallmark of new technology or new innovation going into the market anyway. There's always success stories, and there's always like fantastic failures anytime a new innovation is brought in. So you can expect that kind of thing. Whether they can efficient or effectively institute a CBDC in the Federal Reserve. They have Fed Now, which is the efficiency component of the Federal Reserve banking system. So that is kind of like the beta test, in my view, of CBDCs at the Fed level. If they'll ever get to a digital currency, I don't know, because there's a lot of people in the country still, especially with immigration the way it is, that they don't have phones or anything. They don't use technology to sustain their own livings. So the only way to have a CBDC is to force everyone to use technology, and you'd have to train them. There's something like 150 million people that are locked out of that system before it's even attempted. So I think that's why it's actually taken a lot longer. That I'm sure if they could figure out a way to make everyone have a cell phone and put their banking information on it, like by rule or decree or some kind of legislation.
They did it with contact tracing apps for COVID. So
yeah. Well, I also look at COVID as a test case for how much they can get away with authoritatively. And that's the other thing. So one is, can they physically do it? There's so many people that would be locked out of the system. They'd have to pass, which is actually one of their goals, pass the bare minimum that people can make per year. And then issue it to them, almost like bribing them to use the system. Sure. Which I wouldn't put it past them, because I can see them doing that.
Well, I mean, crypto does it with airdrops. So I think it'll be the same thing with UBI. I mean, it's basically an airdrop of Fed coin.
Yeah. Well, it could be, that could be what we're going to see. The other thing is, I do think there's plenty of people like you, like me, a lot of there's a small number of people in Congress right now who don't believe that that's what the role of government should be in the first place. I do think that there's an uprising. At least people are more aware of it. They're not just taking especially after COVID, they're not taking the Fed's word at face value anymore, just because it could be more efficient and could help you with your help manage the currency. That doesn't mean it's a good idea. And I think there's a lot of people that would just not use it.
Well, to parrot the words from my very good friend, Paul Rosenberg, I remember he was writing and speaking about calling a call to action, or I guess it was a call to inaction for anybody
Right.
who works in the tech sector and IT, do not participate in developing these CBDCs. Even if they are offering you massive salaries and fat bonuses and stuff like that, don't participate. I mean, we need to be actively, as a society, blocking these because the idea is absolutely disgusting. Now, to your points of efficiency, we have Bitcoin, we have Solana, we have 21,000 different projects. I don't think this needs to be in the hands of central bankers or government or CIA or whoever is behind all of this.
Yeah, I don't think it needs to be in their hands, but they do.
Yeah, sure. I get that. But
I don't know. Some ways I feel like I just fall back on faith, and historically we came to a point in 1776 where we're like, we're not going to pay England taxes anymore. Like there was an uprising of enough people in society to say no, that we ended up founding a whole new country. And the bulwark of the Constitution still allows for that. I don't know how closely we follow it anymore, but I just feel like there's a strain of our DNA that is that won't accept CBDC. I don't know. That's not factually based on research or anything like that, but I just feel, I guess I have confidence in people's sense of independence and belief in their own intelligence and skill set to not have to rely on the centralized system.
Very well said. Addison, I love the conversation. Thank you very much. If my listeners want to get a hold of you, if they want to find out more about your work, if they want to pick up your books, where can we send them?
The best place to go is to the wigginsessions.com. My last name does not have an S on it. It's Wiggin, Wiggin, Sessions, like as in a jazz session, .com. And we made it really easy. If you just want to give your email to start receiving my daily missive, and or the way I run the show is I would have you on, for example, and I'd have people like Doug Casey or Bill. I have people on the show that have interesting ideas that I want to share to a wider audience. And then I write about those people in a daily basis and try to plug the ideas into the financial markets and the economy as we see it evolving over time. So I pull that together in a daily email, and you can get that at jointhesessions.com. It's just a page where you give us your email, and then you start receiving it the next day. Amazing. So it's wigginsessions.com and jointhesessions.com. Those are the two choices. The books are there. I've got a number of videos that I've made there. And also you can find The Great American Shell Game, which I just released 10 days ago. And that's really rubber meets the road, how these big ideas of the way the economy is unfolding matches your investment portfolio and the way you should be thinking about putting your money together in the face of what could be the most epic crisis we've seen historically.
Amazing. Addison, I love it. Thank you so much. And I will talk to you soon.
Great. Thanks, Mikkel.